Hey guys, welcome back to Funeral Facts. My name is Victoria, I'm a licensed funeral director and embalmer, and today we're going to be discussing the funeral traditions of the early Hebrews and early Christians. So the early Hebrews believed that man was composed of two elements, the Bazar and the Nefesh. Bazar meant flesh, and Nefesh meant breath, but not breath as in oxygen and respiration. They meant breath as in a form of spirit that inhabited the body. When a person died, they believed that the body deteriorated, but the breath remained. They also believed that a dead spirit could possess a living human, and if the corpse of a dead person was harmed, the soul would suffer. The Hebrews believed in an afterlife, or some form of an afterlife, in the nether world that they called Sheol. Like the Egyptians, they believed that the spirit or breath needed to be put back into the body in order for them to be whole in the afterlife. Before the days of Christ, the dead had their eyes and mouth closed, the body was washed and anointed with spices, and they were dressed in their finest attire. In very, very early days, they were also bound in a fetal position, but that did not continue. After the days of Christ, the body was actually shrouded in linen instead of their finest attire. They tended to put them in more everyday, normal day-to-day wear rather than their finest clothes, because they thought that in the afterlife, the dead would be recognized by what they were wearing. Burial tended to take place the same day as the death because of the arid climate, and the dead were also buried without coffins. People of less wealthy status would be buried in shallow graves, while the wealthy tended to be buried in caves or rock sepulchers that they would carve out themselves, the family. Mourners would perform a ritual called rending of the garments, which in the early days meant stripping off and tearing off their clothes and stripping down to just their head coverings and a loincloth. Nowadays, in modern times, they still do the rending of the garments, but it's in the form of a pin with a black ribbon or cloth attached to it that they pin to their clothes, and they tear it in a ritualistic way. Early Hebrews would also do things like cut their flesh, shave off their beard, throw themselves into the dust, and like the Egyptians and other early cultures, they would hire mourners to make elaborate displays of grief during the funeral. The Hebrews thought that family members that were buried together would remain together in Sheol. Therefore, the tombs were technically placed on the land that the family owned so that they would be together. They preferred simple tombs without any form of adornment. Sometimes they didn't even have any type of markings to show a name on the tombs. And the family, mainly the firstborn son, would be tasked with the responsibility of tending to the grave. And they would also provide offerings and gifts to their deceased relatives in the tomb. Now, the Hebrews rarely performed any type of embalming. There is knowledge of a form of embalming being done to certain people, but primarily they didn't do any type of embalming. And cremation was completely prohibited because of that connection between the soul and the body that they believed in. Now, the early Christians believed that after death there would be a resurrection into a superior body to be with God. Because of this resurrection and transformation on the final day of judgment, they believed that the body should be buried in the earth. They didn't believe that cremation would allow for this resurrection, so they frowned upon it. It was performed in certain special situations, but generally speaking, they really didn't like cremation because they felt like that destroyed the body, and therefore the person would not be able to be resurrected at the end of the final days. The early Christians really gave way for the way that a lot of people think about death today. Unlike other past cultures, they saw everybody as equal in death, and they didn't pay attention to anybody's social or economic standing. They believed that everybody had that same standing in the afterlife. Also, unlike a lot of other ancient religions, they viewed death as simply a form of sleep, and one day they would wake and rise to be with Christ. So they didn't really view it as something grim or untoward or scary or anything like that. They just thought of it as an eternal sleep, and one day they would all rise again. So it was viewed as a rebirth into eternal life rather than something to dread. The Christians would use holy water and incense on the body, and a cross was placed on the chest. If they didn't have a cross, the arms were folded. Now, the reason that they had for having the body be laid out is that they thought in some way that the soul would start at the feet and work its way up the body to exit through the mouth. So they would stretch the limbs out in order to get the soul an easier pathway to get up through the mouth. Their mourning garments were actually not black in those days. They wore white because they believed that white symbolized the rebirth of the person that passed away into eternal life. Christians did hold a wake where people would keep watch over the body for a period of about 3 days usually. This was actually an old Jewish tradition. It actually served a purpose of making sure that the person wasn't really alive and they didn't get buried alive. The Christians used this wake period to gather and say prayers over the deceased, and they eliminated the grand outward displays of grief. Instead, they preferred to keep everything in themselves and have the wake period be a session of reflection on the person's life. Funeral processions were carried out during the day because they believed that that symbolized, again, the entering into eternal life. They had torchbearers in the front of the procession. The torches weren't really to provide any light, but simply as a symbol of the eternal light of heaven. There wasn't really a sermon as we know it today, but they did do an offering of alms to the poor in the form of money or food, and public prayers were then offered for the dead. Now, eventually, the importance of the church came into play, and at that time is when the Christians would then bring the body into church and have a service there, which we know today as a funeral mass in Catholicism. So that gave way to the more elaborate forms of a church service and prayer service that we know of in modern times. Early Christians did not have really any type of undertaker or funeral director. In those times, the funeral was actually carried out by the family under the direction of the clergy. So the family would do all of the care for the body, washing it, dressing it, etc. Like other cultures, it was usually the women relatives that would do all of these things, but there really wasn't any type of funeral director like we would have in the ancient Roman times with the libatinarius. So everything was done by the family with the help of the clergy. Well, that's all the facts I have for you today on ancient Hebrews and ancient Christian traditions. Please like and comment if you would like to. Follow me on my social medias if you would like to as well. The links will be down below. And I will be back again next week with more funeral facts for you. Take care, guys. Bye.